Listen closely, for this is a story that will shake your understanding of love, pride, and the quiet power that lives in silence. Tonight, we journey to a kingdom where ancient wisdom meets modern splendor, where golden palace spires pierce clouds and ancestral drums still echo through marble halls. Picture this moment, a grand engagement ball, chandeliers dripping with crystal light, nobles dressed in silk that costs more than most earn in a lifetime. And at the center of it all, a young woman kneeling on cold marble floors, gathering wooden beads with trembling fingers, while laughter ripples through the crowd like poison in water. Above her stands the ex-lover of the prince, elegant as a viper, her smile sharp enough to draw blood. And the prince himself, he sits motionless on his throne, watching, saying nothing, his silence louder than any scream. The guests whisper behind jeweled fans, questioning everything they thought they knew about their future king. But what none of them understand, what not a single soul in that glittering hall can comprehend, is that silence is not surrender. Sometimes, my friends, silence is strategy. Sometimes it is the patience of the lion before the roar that changes everything. But let us step back from this storm and return to where all great stories begin, to the red soil and open skies of the countryside, where the air tastes like rain, and morning comes with rooster songs that have welcomed the sun for 1,000 years. Her name was Amara, and she was born in a village where community meant more than currency, where elders were honored above celebrities, where a good harvest brought more joy than any diploma from distant cities. She grew up in a small compound with her father, a farmer whose hands knew every seed and season, and her younger sister, whose laughter could brighten the darkest day. Her mother had passed when Amara was only 7, leaving behind lessons wrapped in lullabies and prayers that still guided her daughter's steps. Amara learned early that life was not about what you owned, but about who you served, not about how high you climbed, but about how many hands you lifted along the way. She carried water from the river each dawn, the clay pot balanced perfectly on her head, her feet knowing every stone on the path. She helped her father in the fields, her hands working the earth with reverence. She braided her sister's hair by firelight, while singing songs her grandmother had taught her. The village knew Amara, not for her beauty, though she possessed it in abundance, with eyes that reflected sunlight and a smile that could soften the hardest heart. No, they knew her for something deeper, something that couldn't be purchased or performed. They knew her for her spirit, for the way she moved through the world, as if every person she met carried divinity in their bones. When the widow's roof began to leak before the rainy season, Amara was there with her father, hammer in hand, fixing it while the old woman wept with gratitude. When the pastor's youngest daughter fell ill with fever, Amara brought soup every evening for 2 weeks, sitting beside the child's bed, singing softly until sleep came. During harvest festivals, she danced with the energy of 10 people, pulling shy children into the circle, honoring the elders with traditional steps, her joy infectious and pure. The village elder, a woman whose face mapped a century of wisdom, often watched Amara with knowing eyes. One evening, as the sun melted into the hills and painted the sky in shades of amber and gold, the elder called Amara to the riverside, to the smooth stones where generations had come to hear truth spoken. Amara sat beside the elder, her bare feet dangling in the cool water, watching how the current carried leaves downstream with gentle insistence. The elder said nothing for a long time, simply gazing at the girl with an expression that held both sadness and certainty. The look of someone who sees destiny approaching, like distant thunder. Finally she spoke, her voice carrying the weight of prophecy wrapped in grandmother's love. She told Amara that the river does not forget the sky that gave it rain, and the sky does not forget the earth that calls it home, and that some people are born to walk between worlds, to bridge the gap between what was and what will be. She said that Amara carried the spirit of their ancestors, that grace lived in her bones, like music lives in drums, that one day she would stand in places she could not yet imagine, wearing responsibilities she had never sought. But she warned her, with fingers that gripped her wrist with surprising strength, to never forget where she came from, to never trade her truth for approval, to remember always that grace needs no crown to shine, that humility is not weakness, but the deepest kind of power. Amara listened with her whole heart, not fully understanding, but sensing importance in every word. 300 miles away, in a city where glass towers competed with clouds and streets hummed with the music of ambition and commerce, the prince stood on his balcony watching that same sunset paint the horizon. His name was Kofi, son of the Lion Throne, heir to a legacy that stretched back through generations of kings and warriors whose names were carved in stone and sung in anthems. He wore tailored suits crafted by hands in Italy, shook hands with presidents and prime ministers, signed documents that moved mountains of money and policy, addressed crowds with words that could inspire thousands. But inside, beneath the crown and the cameras and the constant performance, he was tired in a way that sleep could never cure. Tired of conversations that felt like chess games, tired of smiles that hid calculations, tired of being loved for what he represented rather than who he was. His engagement to his ex had been arranged with precision, a strategic alliance between two powerful families, perfect on every spreadsheet and social media post. She was brilliant, ambitious, educated in the finest schools, fluent in 5 languages, capable of charming anyone in any room. But her love, Kofi had slowly realized, was for the throne, not the man who would sit upon it. The realization had come gradually, like dawn breaking through persistent night, in small moments that accumulated into undeniable truth. The way her eyes lit up when discussing royal protocols, but dimmed when he spoke about his dreams. The way she could quote political theory for hours, but grew impatient when he mentioned his childhood fears. The way she perfected her public image with the dedication of an artist, but barely asked how his day had been when cameras stopped flashing. Kofi had begun to feel like a role she was playing, rather than a person she was loving, and the weight of that understanding had settled on his shoulders like stones. So when his convoy had stopped that fateful day, returning from a rural outreach program, and he had heard drums and laughter rising from a village celebration, something in his spirit had simply said stop, pause, breathe, remember what matters. He had stepped out of his vehicle despite his security team's protests, drawn by music that sounded like joy, unfiltered by agenda or ambition. And there, spinning in firelight with children holding her hands, face radiant with pure delight, was Amara. She had not seen him at first, too lost in the moment, too present in her joy. But when she finally looked up, and their eyes met across flames and dancing shadows, something shifted. It was not love at first sight, not in the way poets describe it, not like lightning or collision. It was quieter than that, deeper, more ancient. It was recognition, as if his soul had whispered finally, as if the universe had exhaled yes, as if every road he had walked had been leading to this moment in this village, with this woman who did not know his title or his burden. Kofi had stayed for 2 hours that night, eating simple food that tasted better than palace banquets, listening to stories told by elders whose wisdom needed no degree, watching Amara move through her community like water through thirsty ground, nourishing everything she touched. He learned that she helped at the village school, that she organized the women's cooperative, that children ran to her like she was made of safety and laughter. When he finally left, he carried her memory like a candle flame cupped against wind, precious and fragile and impossibly bright. He returned the next week, and the week after that, each visit feeling less like duty and more like homecoming. They walked together through fields that stretched to forever, sat by rivers that had flowed before kingdoms existed, talked about everything and nothing, under skies so full of stars, they seemed like ancestors watching with approval. Amara had been cautious at first, understandably overwhelmed by the reality of who he was, the impossible distance between her world and his. She had asked him once why he kept coming back, what he could possibly find in their simple village that his palace could not provide. He had looked at her with eyes that held oceans of sincerity and said truth, connection, reminded me that I am human before I am royal. She had smiled at that, understanding more than he expected, and slowly her guard had lowered, revealing the fullness of who she was beneath the initial nervousness. Their love grew like the crops in her father's field, with patience and care and trust that roots were deepening even when nothing seemed to be changing on the surface. He learned her rhythms, the way she hummed when she was content, the way her hands moved when she told stories, the way she closed her eyes when she prayed. She learned his burdens, the pressure of expectations that never slept, the loneliness of being seen but never truly known, the fear that he would become the mask he wore for the world. 6 months passed like this, stolen moments becoming treasured memories, possibility becoming certainty. When Kofi finally told his family that he intended to marry Amara, the palace did not celebrate. It erupted in conflict, in voices raised and lowered, in meetings that stretched past midnight, in concerns voiced with varying degrees of diplomacy and outrage. His father, the king, had stared at him with eyes that had seen wars and peace treaties and asked him if he understood what he was risking. His mother had wept, not from cruelty, but from fear, worried that her son was making a choice his heart desired, but his role could not sustain. The Council of Elders had convened emergency sessions, debating traditions and precedent, questioning whether a woman with no royal blood could possibly understand the complexities of palace life. The nobles had whispered behind closed doors, scandalized and secretly delighted by gossip that would fuel conversations for months. But Kofi had stood firm, his voice steady, as he explained that tradition was built by people brave enough to choose what was right over what was easy, that their kingdom's strength came not from maintaining rigid hierarchies, but from honoring the values they claimed to represent. He reminded them that their ancestors had been warriors and farmers before they were kings, that nobility was about character, not pedigree, that the woman he loved embodied everything their culture claimed to value. But it was not the council or his parents who posed the greatest threat. It was her, the ex, whose name we need not speak, but whose presence loomed like storm clouds gathering. She heard the news while attending a rooftop gala in the city's most exclusive district. Champagne flute, halfway to perfectly painted lips, surrounded by socialites who had spent the evening discussing fashion and philanthropy in equal measure. When someone casually mentioned that the prince was apparently serious about a girl from the countryside, that an engagement announcement was imminent, her hand had frozen mid-air, her smile becoming something carved rather than felt. She had built her entire adult life around the assumption that she would become queen, had sacrificed friendships and dreams and parts of herself to mold into the perfect royal partner. She had studied protocol until she could navigate any diplomatic situation, had cultivated relationships with influential families across the continent, had perfected an image that represented everything a modern African queen should be, educated, elegant, connected, powerful. And now she was being replaced by someone who probably had never attended a state dinner, who likely did not know which fork to use when, who definitely had not spent years preparing for this role. The rage that filled her was cold rather than hot, calculating rather than explosive. She did not scream or throw her champagne glass, or make a scene that would be remembered and gossiped about. Instead, she smiled, excused herself from the party, went home to her penthouse apartment with views of the city lights, and began to plan. She understood power better than most, knew that direct confrontation would make her look bitter and desperate, that she needed to be subtle, strategic, to plant seeds of doubt rather than launch obvious attacks. So she began a campaign of whispers and implications, of carefully crafted social media posts that reminded everyone what a real royal partnership looked like, of public appearances that showcased her grace and sophistication, of comments that seemed supportive on the surface but carried undertones of concern. She would attend charity events and wonder aloud if the prince's new interest understood the complexities of royal philanthropy. She would post throwback photos from diplomatic trips with captions about legacy and heritage. She would talk to journalists off the record, expressing nothing but wishes for the prince's happiness while mentioning how challenging palace life could be for someone unaccustomed to such scrutiny. And slowly, like poison seeping into groundwater, doubt began to spread through the noble circles. Meanwhile, Amara had moved to the city, and the transition had been more overwhelming than she could have imagined. The palace was not just larger than her village. It was a different universe entirely, with protocols for everything, from how to address different ranks of nobility to which entrance to use, depending on the time of day. Her room alone was bigger than her family's entire house, with a bathroom that had more mirrors than her village had windows. She woke to silence instead of roosters, to staff bringing breakfast instead of her father's voice, calling her to help with morning chores. She missed everything: the smell of firewood smoke, the taste of water from the clay pot, the sound of children playing in dusty streets, the sight of stars unobscured by city lights. But Kofi had been patient and attentive, sensing her displacement and doing everything he could to ease the transition. He showed her the palace gardens, where she could walk among growing things and remember that nature existed even in this concrete world. He introduced her to the kitchen staff, the gardeners, the maintenance workers, encouraging her to build relationships rather than maintain distance. He never asked her to change her way of speaking or dressing or being, never suggested that her village manners needed refining, or her simple tastes needed elevation. But outside the protective bubble Kofi tried to create, the pressure mounted steadily. Palace staff who had served the ex whispered comparisons in hallways, noting how the previous almost princess had known everyone's names and roles, how she had moved through formal dinners with practiced ease, how she had never seemed uncertain or overwhelmed. Distant relatives who visited made comments that seemed helpful but felt like criticism, offering to teach Amara proper etiquette, suggesting she might want to update her wardrobe, wondering aloud if she understood the historical significance of various palace traditions. And then there were the social events, the endless parade of functions where Amara felt like an exhibit rather than a participant, where women in designer gowns asked questions that seemed innocent but tested her knowledge, where men assessed her with eyes that wondered what the prince possibly saw in someone so ordinary. Through it all, the ex maintained a presence like smoke, appearing at the same charity galas and cultural events, always perfectly dressed, always gracious, always reminding everyone through her mere existence of what they were losing. She never said anything directly critical about Amara, never had to, because her polished perfection spoke volumes without words. One particular afternoon tea, hosted by a duchess, had been especially difficult. Amara had worn a dress Kofi assured her was appropriate, had studied the guest list and tried to remember names and titles, had practiced small talk with palace staff who had kindly offered to help. But from the moment she arrived, she felt the weight of judgment, the way conversations paused when she entered, the way women smiled with mouths but not eyes, the way questions came that felt like tests disguised as interest. And then the ex had arrived, 20 minutes fashionably late, wearing white that seemed to glow against her skin, moving through the room like she owned it, because in many ways she once had. She had greeted Amara with a hug that felt like a threat, with words that sounded supportive, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut. She had said how brave Amara must be to take on such responsibility, how overwhelming palace life could be, even for those born into it, how she herself had needed years to truly understand the complexities, and throughout it all, her smile had never wavered, even as her words landed like small stones, thrown with precision. Amara had maintained her composure, had responded with grace, but inside, she had felt herself shrinking, wondering if everyone was right, if she was naive to think love could be enough. That evening, she had almost told Kofi she wanted to go home, that maybe this was a mistake, that perhaps she was not strong enough for this world, that seemed designed to remind her she did not belong. They had been walking in the palace gardens, the sun setting behind ornate walls, when the words had started to form. But before she could speak them, Kofi had stopped walking and turned to face her, his hands gentle on her shoulders, his eyes seeing past her attempted smile to the hurt underneath. He had told her that he knew these months had been hard, that he understood the pressure she was under, that he saw how people treated her, and it made him angry in ways he had never been angry before. But he had also told her something else, something that settled into her bones like truth finding home. He said that the loudest voices are often the emptiest, that people who truly have power do not need to constantly remind others of it, that those who feel threatened will always attack because fear makes people small. He said that he hadn't chosen her despite her background, but because of everything her background had made her: compassionate, humble, grounded in values that his world desperately needed. He said that she did no need to become like them, that the whole point was for them to remember what they had forgotten. Amara had cried then, not from sadness, but from relief, from the release of tension she had been carrying like rocks in her pockets. And Kofi had held her while the sun completed its descent and the garden lights flickered on. And somewhere in the palace, someone played a piano that drifted through open windows. They had stayed there until stars appeared, talking about everything and nothing, and by the time they returned inside, Amara's resolve had strengthened, roots deepening into soil that would hold against whatever storms came. But the ex was not finished, not even close, because she had been planning something bigger than whispered doubts and social media implications. She had been planning a moment, a confrontation, a public demonstration that would expose what she saw as the fundamental unsuitability of this village girl to be queen. And the opportunity she had been waiting for was approaching fast: the royal engagement ball, an event that would draw nobles from across the continent, diplomats from a dozen countries, journalists whose cameras would capture every moment for audiences of millions. It would be the perfect stage for her final move, the moment when she would expose the truth she believed everyone was too polite or too blind to acknowledge. The night of the ball arrived with a moon that hung low and full, as if the sky itself was leaning in to watch what would unfold. The palace had been transformed into something from dreams or fairy tales. with flowers flown in from 3 countries, with ice sculptures carved by artists who worked through the night, with orchestras positioned in 3 different halls to ensure music flowed like water through every space. Security was unprecedented, with cameras at every entrance, guest lists verified multiple times, protocol officers ensuring every detail matched the precision this event demanded. Nobles arrived in cars that cost more than houses, in gowns that took months to create, in jewelry that could fund hospitals or schools, if anyone thought to liquidate it for such purposes. Diplomats came with their practiced smiles and careful words, representatives of governments who wanted to maintain good relations with this wealthy and strategic kingdom. And journalists came with cameras and questions, ready to document what would be analyzed and discussed for weeks after. Amara had prepared for this night, like a student preparing for the most important exam of her life, studying guest lists until she could recognize faces and names, practicing small talk until words felt less foreign, choosing her outfit with more care than she had ever chosen anything. She had finally decided on a gown that honored both worlds she now inhabited. Cream silk that spoke to palace elegance but was simpler than what most guests would wear, with traditional African prints subtly incorporated into the design, with embroidery that told stories if you looked close enough to see them. And around her neck, restrung with stronger thread, and blessed again by her village elder during a recent visit home, she wore her grandmother's wooden beads. Kofi had seen them and smiled, had told her they were perfect, had understood without explanation why she needed to wear something that carried memory and meaning rather than just market value. When they entered the grand hall together, when the announcer's voice rang out with titles and names, when 1,000 faces turned toward them and cameras flashed like lightning, Amara had felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her breath coming shallow, despite her best efforts to appear calm. But Kofi's hand on her back was steady, his presence beside her, a reminder that she was not alone, that whatever came next, they would face together. The applause had been thunderous, a wall of sound that seemed to physically push against them, and for a moment, Amara had allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be okay. The evening unfolded in carefully choreographed segments. A receiving line where they greeted guests who offered congratulations with varying degrees of sincerity. A formal dinner where Amara navigated multiple courses and utensils with the competence her tutoring had provided. Toasts that ranged from genuinely warm to diplomatically neutral. She had met a duchess from a neighboring kingdom who was kind, a diplomat from Europe who seemed genuinely interested in her village work, several younger nobles who confessed they found palace life suffocating and admired her for bringing fresh perspective. But she had also endured subtle slights, questions about her education that implied surprise she could read, comments about her dress that praised its simplicity in ways that felt less than complimentary, and always, the awareness of the ex moving through the crowd like a shark through water, elegant and predatory and patient. Then came the gift presentation, a tradition where nobles and family members offered symbolic presents to the engaged couple. Gold artifacts, ancient texts, commissioned paintings, promises of support and alliance. Amara had received each with gratitude, with words coached by protocol officers, but delivered with sincerity she insisted on maintaining. And then the ex had stepped forward, and the room had somehow become quieter, even though no one had consciously stopped talking. She had approached with a velvet box that immediately drew attention because its size and presentation suggested contents of significant value. When she opened it to reveal a diamond necklace that caught light and threw it around the room like promises of wealth and status, the crowd's reaction had been audible, a collective intake of breath that spoke to both the beauty and the expense of the piece. The ex had held it up, with the graceful presentation of someone comfortable, being the center of attention, and her voice when she spoke had been honey-sweet, deliberately kind, which somehow made what came next even more cutting. She had said this was for the future princess, because every queen deserves to shine, and the implication had hung in the air like smoke that everyone pretended not to smell, unlike what you are currently wearing. She had gestured to Amara's wooden beads with a smile that seemed warm to anyone not looking closely, had called them charming, in a tone that made charm sound like a deficiency rather than a quality. She had asked about their origin, their meaning, and when Amara had started to explain about her grandmother, about the blessing, about what they represented, the ex had stepped closer, as if to examine them more carefully. What happened next occurred so quickly that many guests would later debate whether it was accident or intention, though those who watched closely had no doubt. The ex had reached out, her fingers making contact with the beads, and with a movement that could have been clumsiness but felt like calculated cruelty, she had pulled just hard enough for the string to snap. The sound was small, a tiny crack that should not have carried in a room of hundreds, but somehow everyone heard it. Or perhaps they heard the silence that followed. And then the beads were falling, bouncing, scattering across marble floors, rolling under shoes and table legs, disappearing into corners and shadows. Amara had gasped, a sound of pain that had nothing to do with physical hurt, and everything to do with violation, with the destruction of something irreplaceable. She had dropped to her knees immediately, instinctively, her hands scrambling to gather what she could, while her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. Around her, the crowd's reaction had been a mixture of shock and speculation, some genuinely horrified, others exchanging glances that suggested this confirmed suspicions they had privately harbored. The ex had stood above her, hand flying to her mouth, in a display of dismay that felt rehearsed, her apologies flowing like water from a tap, empty and endless. And Kofi? The prince had remained seated on the dais throughout this unfolding drama, his position requiring he oversee the entire event rather than circulate through the crowd. From his elevated vantage point, he had watched everything, had seen the approach, the presentation, the moment of destruction. His hands had gripped the arms of his throne hard enough that his knuckles went white. His jaw had clenched so tight, a muscle jumped in his cheek. But he had not moved, had not spoken, had maintained a silence that confused and disappointed many who witnessed it. The whispers had started immediately, guests leaning toward each other behind fans and champagne glasses, questioning what kind of man sat motionless, while his fiancée was humiliated, wondering if perhaps he regretted his choice, speculating that maybe his silence was consent to what had occurred. Even some of the elders had frowned, troubled by what appeared to be weakness or indifference in someone they expected to lead with strength. But what none of them understood, what they could not see because they were looking at the surface rather than the depths, was that Kofi's silence was no weakness. It was restraint of a kind most people never have to exercise, control over rage that wanted to erupt but was being held back for reasons they would soon understand. He had waited, watching as Amara knelt and gathered beads with shaking hands, as guests whispered and stared, as the ex continued her performance of apologetic concern. He had waited until enough beads were collected, until Amara's hands stilled, until the moment felt full enough to break. And then, in a movement that silenced every whisper and drew every eye, he had stood, not quickly, not with obvious anger, but with a deliberate slowness that somehow communicated power more effectively than any rush could have. He had descended the steps from his throne with footfalls that echoed in the sudden quiet, had walked past nobles who parted like water, had moved past the ex without even acknowledging her presence. And then, before hundreds of witnesses and dozens of cameras, before nobles and diplomats and family members, the prince had knelt. He had lowered himself to the marble floor beside his fiancée, and without a word, had begun picking up beads, one by one, carefully, as if each was a jewel more precious than any diamond that had been offered that night. The shock in the room had been almost tangible, a collective inability to process what was happening, because princes did not kneel, except in ceremony. Royalty did not lower themselves to floors. Future kings did not gather broken things with their own hands. But Kofi had continued, unbothered by protocol or perception, focused entirely on the task and the woman beside him. Together they had collected every bead they could find, Kofi checking under tables and chairs, retrieving ones that had rolled far from where they fell, handling each with a care that communicated value beyond material measure. When they had gathered all they could recover, when his palm held a collection of wooden beads stained with age and use and love, he had stood and helped Amara to her feet. Then he had turned to face the crowd, and his expression had been calm, in a way that felt dangerous, composed in a manner that suggested volcanic pressure barely contained beneath surface control. The silence in that grand hall had been absolute, hundreds of people frozen in anticipation, sensing that whatever came next would be significant, that this moment was pivoting towards something none of them had expected when they arrived in their expensive cars and designer gowns. And when Kofi spoke, his voice had not been loud, had not been angry in an obvious way, but it had carried to every corner of that vast space, had commanded attention with an authority that reminded everyone exactly who he was and what power he held. He had started with a question directed at all of them, asking if they wanted to know why he chose her, why he had defied expectations and tradition, and the easier path. And then he had told them, not with the diplomatic language they were accustomed to hearing from him, but with raw honesty that left no room for misinterpretation. He had said that while some people spent their lives learning to manipulate, Amara had learned to love. While some polished their image for public consumption, she had served her community without cameras or recognition. While some climbed ladders and stepped on others to reach heights they believed they deserved, she had spent her energy lifting people up, helping without expectation of return, giving without calculation of benefit. He had held up the wooden beads, these simple objects that probably cost less than the appetizers that had been served, and he had told their story. He had spoken about Amara's grandmother, a woman who raised 5 children alone, after her husband died, working fields that fed the village, a woman who never missed church even when her own stomach was empty, a woman who taught her granddaughter that grace needs no crown to shine, because true grace comes from within and radiates outward, regardless of external decoration or validation. Then he had turned his attention to the ex, and his gaze had been steady rather than harsh, sad rather than angry, disappointed rather than vengeful. He had told her that she mistook humility for weakness, that she confused silence with defeat, that she had fundamentally misunderstood what strength actually means and where it actually comes from. He had explained that he remained silent, not because he was uncertain or conflicted, but because he wanted to see who she truly was, when she thought she had the advantage, when she believed her performance would sway opinion and expose what she saw as Amara's inadequacy. He had said that her actions that night had indeed exposed truth, but not the truth she intended, because what everyone had witnessed was not Amara's unsuitability, but the ex's fundamental inability to understand what values actually matter. And here his voice had softened, had taken on a tone that was almost gentle, as he assured her that he wished her no harm, held no desire for revenge, but that he would never allow her to harm Amara again. Not tonight. Not ever. And if that meant she needed to leave his palace and his life permanently, then that was a consequence she had brought upon herself. The ex's face had gone pale, her carefully maintained composure cracking to reveal shock and humiliation. Underneath, and in that moment she finally understood that she had lost, not just the prince, but also the respect of everyone watching. But Kofi had not been finished, because this moment needed to be about more than calling out cruelty or defending his choice. He had turned back to address the full assembly, and his voice had shifted from personal to visionary, from immediate to future-focused. He had announced that tomorrow he would be unveiling a new royal initiative, a foundation dedicated to supporting rural communities throughout their kingdom and beyond, focused on education, healthcare, economic opportunity, and cultural preservation. And this foundation would be led by Amara, not as a ceremonial position or token gesture, but as a genuine appointment based on her deep understanding of these communities' needs and her proven track record of service. He had spoken about how palace life could become disconnected from the real experiences of most citizens, how power could create bubbles that insulated those within from understanding those without, how their kingdom's future strength depended on bridging gaps rather than widening them. He had said that Amara represented a chance to reconnect royal resources with grassroots wisdom, to combine institutional power with community knowledge, to create change that actually mattered to people whose lives were far from palace halls and political debates. And as he spoke, something had shifted in the room, skepticism giving way to consideration, doubt transforming into possibility, resistance melting into curiosity about what this unconventional choice might actually mean for their kingdom's trajectory. The applause, when it came, had started slowly, a few people clapping uncertainly, then others joining, then more, until it built into something thunderous and genuine, no longer the polite acknowledgement that protocol demanded, but real appreciation for words that felt true and vision that felt needed. Nobles who had dismissed Amara were reconsidering. Diplomats were revising assessments. Family members were seeing past their concerns to something larger than their immediate comfort. Even the palace staff, standing along the walls as they always did during such events, had begun to clap with enthusiasm that broke protocol but felt entirely appropriate. And Amara, standing beside Kofi, with tears finally falling freely down her cheeks, had felt something shift inside herself too, a weight lifting that she had not fully realized she had been carrying. She was still overwhelmed, still uncertain about many things, still learning to navigate a world so different from everything she had known. But she was also, in that moment, certain that she was where she was supposed to be, doing what she was meant to do, loved by someone who saw her fully and chose her anyway. Kofi had taken her hand then, had led her to the center of the floor as the orchestra began to play, and they had danced not as performance or obligation, but as promise, as partnership, as two people choosing each other despite and because of everything that made their union unlikely. The days that followed the ball were marked by a quiet that felt like exhale after holding breath too long. The ex had left the city the morning after, not in scandal exactly, but in silence, returning to her family's coastal estate, where waves crashed against rocks, and wind reminded her of things she had spent years trying to forget. She spent those first days sitting on balconies and walking beaches, processing what had happened, and more importantly, who she had become. In pursuit of ambition, she had confused with purpose. Her mother found her one evening, as the sun was setting, found her daughter crying, in a way she hadn't cried since childhood, with a rawness that suggested something breaking open rather than just breaking. They had talked through the night, mother and daughter, about dreams and disappointments, about the difference between wanting to be chosen and wanting to be loved, about how sometimes losing what you thought you needed creates space for discovering what you actually want. And slowly, in conversations that continued over weeks, the ex began to consider that perhaps this was not an ending, but rather a beginning, not a failure but a release, not loss, but liberation from a path that would have taken her further from herself with every step. Meanwhile, Amara had returned to her village for the foundation's official launch, and the celebration that greeted her was unlike anything the countryside had seen in generations. The entire community had gathered, not just from her village, but from neighboring ones too, people walking for hours to witness this moment when one of their own was being honored by the palace. Traditional dancers performed with energy that made the ground tremble. Drummers played rhythms that had called communities together for centuries. Elders sat in places of honor, wearing their finest traditional robes. Children ran between adults with the kind of joy that needs no reason beyond being alive and together. The ceremony itself had blended formal protocol with village tradition. Government officials in suits standing beside farmers in work clothes, palace representatives sharing space with community leaders whose authority came from respect rather than appointment. Speeches in formal language, followed by blessings in dialects that predated the kingdom itself. Amara had worn traditional dress for the occasion, colors bright as sunset, patterns telling stories, and when she spoke to the crowd, her voice had carried the confidence of someone who finally understood that she didn't need to choose between worlds, but could instead bridge them. She had talked about the foundation's goals with specificity that came from lived experience, had outlined programs that addressed real needs rather than assumed ones, had promised partnership rather than charity, collaboration rather than condescension. And when she finished speaking, when the applause died down, her father had stood and walked to where she stood on the makeshift platform they had built for the occasion. He had embraced her while the crowd watched, this farmer whose hands bore the marks of decades working soil, whose face carried lines that mapped both hardship and joy, whose eyes shone with tears he did not bother hiding. He had whispered so, only she could hear that her mother would have been so proud, that he was so proud, that she had honored their family and their village, not by leaving them behind, but by bringing their values forward into spaces that needed them desperately. Then he had turned to address everyone gathered, his voice cracking with emotion as he spoke about watching his daughter grow, about the values her mother had instilled before leaving too soon, about how communities raise children together. And this moment belonged to all of them, not just one family. The celebration that followed had lasted until the moon was high and stars filled the sky like blessings made visible. People eating together from shared pots, dancing until exhaustion, telling stories that would become part of village history. And through it all, Kofi had been present, not as prince requiring deference, but as Amara's partner, sitting with elders and listening to their wisdom, playing with children who forgot to be intimidated once he joined their games, helping serve food, because Amara had taught him that leadership means service. He had never felt more himself than in those hours, had never felt more certain that his choice had been right, not just for his heart, but for his kingdom's future, for the kind of leader he wanted to become. The wedding, when it came 3 months later, was everything that moment promised and more. They had chosen to hold it outdoors, in the palace's most expansive gardens, under open sky rather than vaulted ceilings, surrounded by growing things rather than cold marble. The guest list had been carefully balanced, half from the palace world of nobles and diplomats and political necessity, half from Amara's village and surrounding communities, people who had never seen such luxury, sitting beside people who had never known such simplicity. The aesthetic had honored both worlds completely. Traditional African fabrics, draped alongside silk, imported from across oceans. Drums positioned near string quartets, village elders given seats of honor equal to foreign dignitaries. Amara had walked down an aisle lined with flowers from both palace hothouses and village gardens. Her hand in her father's, her dress a masterpiece that combined modern design with traditional elements, patterns that told her family's story, woven into fabric that cost more than her father earned in years. Kofi had waited at the altar, wearing robes that mixed royal regalia with traditional ceremonial dress, his face showing emotion. He usually kept controlled, tears on his cheeks that he made no attempt to hide, because this was not a day for maintaining performance. This was a day for being fully present in truth and vulnerability and overwhelming joy. The ceremony itself had woven together multiple traditions, palace protocols that dated back centuries, village customs that predated the kingdom, religious blessings from multiple faiths represented among their guests, promises spoken in 3 languages so everyone could understand the vows being made. When the elder from Amara's village had stood to offer blessing, she had spoken the same words she had told Amara years before, by the riverside, about how the river remembers the sky, and the sky remembers the earth, about how grace needs no crown to shine, and her voice had carried across the assembled crowd with an authority that needed no title to command respect. And when Kofi and Amara had finally been pronounced married, when they had kissed while drums exploded into celebration and both crowds erupted in joy, when they had turned to face their guests as partners officially bound, the sun had been setting behind them in shades of gold and orange and red that seemed almost impossibly perfect, as if the universe itself was celebrating. The reception had continued late into the night. Food from both worlds shared at tables where unlikely friendships formed, music shifting between traditional and modern, dancing that mixed village steps with ballroom movements, conversations that bridged divides people had assumed were unbridgeable. And through it all, Amara and Kofi had moved together, laughing and crying and dancing and holding each other close, 2 people from different worlds, creating something new together. In the months and years that followed, the foundation Amara led became one of the kingdom's most successful initiatives, not because it had the most funding, though it was well-resourced, but because it operated with authenticity and accountability that government programs rarely achieved. Amara traveled constantly between the city and countryside, bringing rural voices into policy conversations, ensuring programs addressed actual needs rather than assumed ones, building partnerships that respected community wisdom while providing institutional support. She became known not as the prince's wife, who did charity work, but as a leader in her own right, someone whose speeches were quoted and whose approach was studied by organizations across the continent. Kofi, watching her grow into this role, while managing his own increasing responsibilities as his father aged and began transitioning power, felt vindicated in ways that went beyond personal satisfaction, because their partnership was proving that tradition and progress need not be opposing forces, that opening doors to new voices strengthened rather than weakened institutions. They had children eventually, 3 of them, who grew up speaking multiple languages and feeling comfortable in both palace halls and village compounds, who understood that privilege meant responsibility and power meant service, who carried their grandmother's lessons about grace forward into a future none could fully predict, but all could help shape. And the ex, who had eventually returned to the city and built a different kind of life for herself, working in international development and finding purpose she had never discovered in pursuit of crowns, sometimes saw news of their family and felt something that was no longer bitter, something closer to gratitude, that her loss had freed her to find a truer path. So ends this tale, my people, this story of love and pride, and the quiet power that lives in choosing what is right over what is easy. You have walked with me through palace halls and village compounds, through moments of humiliation and triumph, through silence that was not weakness but strategy, through choices that seemed impossible but proved transformative. And what have we learned together? That grace, true grace, needs no crown to shine, because it radiates from within, regardless of external decoration. That humility is not smallness, but rather strength so secure it needs no proof or performance. That silence, real silence, can be the patience of the lion before the roar that changes everything. That traditions become meaningful only when we question them, only when we choose them consciously rather than follow them blindly, only when we allow them to evolve as our understanding deepens and our world expands. We have learned that love, when it is real, sees beyond surface to soul, beyond title to truth, beyond what someone can provide to who someone actually is. And we have been reminded that our choices ripple outward in ways we cannot always predict, that standing firm in our values, even when pressured to compromise them, creates permission for others to do the same, that one person's courage to be authentic can inspire thousands to question their own performances. If this story has touched something in you, if it has reminded you of your own worth, or given you strength to walk your own path, or simply entertained you for these minutes we have shared, then honor it by sharing it forward, by letting these words find others who might need them. Subscribe so you will hear more stories, because our heritage lives in the telling, our wisdom survives through the sharing, our culture thrives when we refuse to let it be forgotten. Go well, my people, until we meet again in the next story that calls us home.